So Sherry, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Henrietta, and thanks for inviting me. Let's see. And okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody who's with us today and everybody who's with us in the future. I guess like everybody else, I've had to get used to Zoom this past year, and it's not the same as a real audience, I'm afraid, but it's as good as we can do in the circumstances. So what I'm going to do today is a slice of my new book, which is out on November 15th, and I've been working on it now for I don't know, 6 or so years, along with everything else I do. I'm not going to give you the whole life of Calhoun, but a piece of the book and a piece of New Mexico history. I would add that I stumbled across Calhoun back, let's see, in 2012, the year we were celebrating statehood, and I was looking for something to give a talk on for the Historical Society, and I found this guy, and the more I looked at him, the more interesting he got. And so anyhow, it went from a talk to a book, and some years of my life. So I want to talk about early territorial politics. We watch the news today and shake our heads and think it can't be any worse, but I would like to remind everybody that it actually was worse at one time. It was worse in New Mexico, and we lived through it, although it did have some consequences. In James Silas Calhoun arrived in New Mexico in July of 1849, and with him were his 2 daughters, their husbands, a granddaughter, and some friends from Georgia. He'd been appointed New Mexico's first Indian agent by President Zachary Taylor and instructed to move the statehood process along. 20 months later, he became the first territorial governor. Indian agents were political appointees, but even under the spoils system, Calhoun was surprisingly well qualified. He had been a lawyer, a judge, a merchant, a cotton broker, a shipper, and a banker in Georgia. He had also been a very active politician and had served in the Georgia legislature. He served in the Mexican War, and he spoke Spanish, which was fairly unusual for the appointees who were sent here. Now, New Mexico, or Santa Fe in those days, was not the charming place it is today. It was not impressive, and newly arrived Americans wrote many disparaging letters home about Santa Fe. They rolled into a central plaza of hand-packed clay, devoid of greenery, and there were the stores of traders around the plaza, but there were also plenty of gambling dens. There were unpaved, dirty streets that radiated outward, connecting scattered adobe houses surrounded by large fields of corn. One officer's wife wrote home, "It is the most miserable, squalid-looking place I ever beheld. The houses are mud, the fences are mud, the churches and courts are mud. In fact, it is all mud." The people of Santa Fe were quite a mixed bunch. There were the New Mexicans descended from Spanish and Mexican colonists. There were visiting Pueblo Indians who were there to trade. There were American soldiers and a lot of former soldiers. There were 49ers on their way to California and resident traders who had married into local families. After the Mexican War, there was a crop of newly arrived Americans who hoped to make their fortune in this new American possession. And they didn't all mix amicably. Calhoun made the rounds and got acquainted with Santa Fe's movers and shakers. He was a diehard Whig who had been deeply involved in politics in Georgia. He expected to find Whigs and Democrats in Santa Fe, and they were here, but national politics played a pretty minor role. The most debated issue in New Mexico at the time was statehood. Calhoun found one group that was strongly in favor of statehood and another that was strongly opposed. And here I'm doing some fudging with my images. The statehood supporters were led by Manuel Alvarez and Richard Waitman. This is not an image of Alvarez, but it is an image of a Santa Fe trader. As far as I know, we have never found an image of Alvarez, which is a shame because he was a central figure in early New Mexico. Alvarez was an educated Spaniard who had lived in Santa Fe since 1824. He had been a fur trapper and a United States consul. When Calhoun met him, Alvarez was a successful trader and merchant with a store on Plaza. He was 5 years older than Calhoun, and considering that Calhoun had also been a merchant in Georgia, the two would have had a lot in common, and I think this was an instant friendship. Richard Waitman, Richard Waitman was from Washington, D.C. He had served in the Mexican War, and after mustering out, he came back to New Mexico. He was 24 years younger than Alvarez. Waitman had hung out his shingle and was practicing law in Santa Fe. The Alvarez faction not only advocated for statehood, but protested bitterly the daily injustices of the military government and its hirelings. Alvarez had the support of native New Mexicans who made up the vast majority of people. In their faction were Whigs and Democrats, New Mexicans and Americans. Oops, okay. And if we had sound effects, this would be the villain music right here. The opponents of statehood had a financial stake in the military government as civil appointees or contractors. They also opposed the taxation likely to come with statehood. Their leader was Job Houghton, an engineer by training who'd been appointed a judge by General Kearney. Houghton knew nothing about the law. His decisions always favored his own faction or even himself, and he was not above making decisions in cases in which he was involved. And the Houghton party also included Whigs and Democrats, Americans and New Mexicans. So this was not the political climate that Calhoun was used to, and he found it a little strange, but learned to operate within it. Calhoun enjoyed cordial relations with both factions for several months, but he soon threw in with Alvarez and Waitman. Not only did they have the same goals that he did, but he liked the two men personally. And he was also happy to have them lead the charge, because in his day job as Indian agent, the government expected him to manage 40,000 some Indian people. Now, this is a guy we've never heard of in New Mexico, who he was well known in Georgia, and he had more of a hand in New Mexico's early development than anybody knows. By October 1849, Calhoun had sized things up. And he wrote a kind of progress report on his statehood efforts and sent it to his close friend, Georgia Congressman William Dawson. In this letter, he laid out the obstacles to New Mexico statehood. He asked Dawson to read it to the president and his cabinet, and also to share it with the Georgia delegation. So the obstacles he laid out: first, the military governor, Colonel John Monroe, refused to recognize the actions of the citizens' effort of the citizens to create a civil government. Monroe was a Whig, but he was not a Taylor man. The second obstacle was the Houghton party's machinations. American Whigs, who were contractors, settlers, and agents dependent on military for their livelihood, had aligned with Democrats, mostly military officers, to support territorial status and oppose statehood. They reflected sentiments of congressmen who wanted territorial governments in California, Utah, and New Mexico. They believed New Mexicans just weren't ready for statehood and needed tutoring. Calhoun didn't see why the people couldn't just decide for themselves. The third obstacle that he laid out in this letter was the Texas claim to New Mexico land east of the Rio Grande. New Mexicans were adamantly opposed to the Texas claim, but there is some evidence that the Statehood Party was less opposed. And this is a map of what Texas thought it looked like. Calhoun would have been torn. He believed strongly in states' rights, and the Alvarez faction did represent the wishes of Native New Mexicans. On the other hand, the South, and Georgia in particular, had always sided with Texas. Georgians fought in the Texas Revolution. Mirabeau Lamar, the Texas Republic's second president, was from the same town as Calhoun, and they knew each other well. More importantly, Southern Whigs wanted to maintain both slavery and the Union. They were willing to give in to Texas claims rather than threaten the Union, and this was Calhoun's position. This is something that he wrote at the time. The United States might be compelled to yield to the claim of Texas rather than endanger the integrity of the Union. That's a pretty classical position of your Southern Whig. Now, in the spring of 1850, New Mexico delegates to a convention created a new state constitution and elected Richard Waitman as senator and Manuel Alvarez as lieutenant governor. And this is what New Mexico thought it looked like. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., as New Mexicans squabbled over statehood, Congress was doing the same at length. They also argued about whether they should permit slavery in the territories taken from Mexico and how to placate Texas in its demand for half of New Mexico. The disputes were so intense that men armed themselves and people feared violence in Washington, D.C. Mississippi's senators said that if New Mexico continued to resist Texas, blood would be shed. And quote, the combined manhood of the South would rush to the conflict. Close quotes. Texans were already on their way to New Mexico, according to one rumor. I think before I wrote this, I didn't have an appreciation of how close New Mexico came to pushing the nation into an early version of the Civil War, but it was intensely heated in Washington, D.C., and they were only able to back away from this with a compromise crafted by Henry Clay. Henry Clay, by the way, was one of Calhoun's heroes. A furious President Taylor said the Texans must be put down and he would lead the army himself. But in July, he died, and New Mexico lost its most influential supporter of statehood. Millard Fillmore became president and saw it as his duty to protect New Mexico from Texas, but he didn't have the same strong sentiments about statehood. Ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 passed, settling the New Mexico-Texas border, establishing New Mexico as a territory, and paying Texas $10 million for its so-called loss. And Calhoun's good friends Alexander Stevens and Robert Toombs, along with Dawson, who we've seen already, persuaded Fillmore to appoint Calhoun governor. And here is his letter of nomination. This is what Congress thought we should look like, and what we did look like for quite a while. Richard Waitman was traveling across country all this time and arrived in Washington, D.C. with New Mexico's newly written Constitution in hand, just after the Compromise of 1850 had passed. And so we became a territory. Calhoun's inauguration was March 3rd, 1851, outside of the Palace of Governors. In his first two speeches, he made it clear that he wasn't giving up on statehood. He championed voting rights. Here's a comment he made in one of his speeches. It is our solemn duty so to guard the rights of our citizens that their own votes shall reflect their own purposes. He opposed capital punishment, but he wasn't ready to abolish it. He wanted to outlaw gambling. He wanted Congress to provide funding for the schools. And he thought the government should quote, take special care of the weak and the innocent. New Mexico was still deeply divided. The new status of territory might have pleased some in the Houghton faction, but they would not have been pleased at Calhoun's appointment as governor. So he became their new target. Although New Mexicans still favored Calhoun's faction. When citizens elected their legislators in May 1851, most were Calhoun partisans. The War Department recalled Colonel Monroe, but his replacement, Colonel Edwin Sumner was even more hostile to Calhoun. From his inauguration until he departed in May 1852, the enemies of Calhoun did their utmost to sabotage everything he tried to do. They reviled him in the Santa Fe Gazette, the city's only newspaper, which they owned, and in national newspapers. They lied to Pueblo Indians, saying the government would take their land away. They lied to Comanches and other tribes visiting Santa Fe that the governor intended to have them killed. They spread rumors that New Mexicans and Pueblo Indians planned new uprisings, or that Navajos had devastated distant villages. They visited Washington, D.C. in a group and tried to get Calhoun and Waitman recalled. They failed, but they also did a lot of damage, both to the faction, but mainly to New Mexico. Then there was the military. Monroe and Sumner opposed Calhoun in every way, from denying him the use of the commissary to denying him a troop escort to visit distant tribes. Calhoun's rapidly declining health in 1852 softened Sumner's attitude, and he showed kindness and courtesy to the ailing governor. Still, Sumner had no use for New Mexico and said it was a waste of money to defend it. And the Secretary of War agreed. The Houghton faction continued to malign Calhoun in New Mexico and in Washington, D.C. long after his death. They kept up their drumbeat that New Mexicans were uneducated, uncivilized, and unfit to be part of the United States. It would be a long time before New Mexico could overcome these falsehoods. And this is a clipping from this is one paragraph from a newspaper story published in the East within days of Calhoun's deaths. I'm sure that they didn't know at the time that he was dead, but they announced to the world that the government of New Mexico was a failure. They said that the attempt to maintain a territorial government in New Mexico has failed. The population of that territory, composed chiefly of Mexicans who lived there when it was conquered from Mexico, are indisposed to sustain the institutions established there by the United States. And it went on in the same vein. This was, of course, total fiction. The institutions of the United States were taking hold in New Mexico. They had participated in several elections. They'd had 2 legislative sessions in which they passed good laws. They'd written a constitution, but this kind of thing went on for years and years, and it was part of the reason why New Mexico didn't become a state for such a long time. Calhoun himself died on the Kansas prairie in June of 1852 and was buried in Kansas City. This headstone shows the wrong birth date. It was actually 1799. But anyway, my conclusion in the book is that even though he was here for such a long time, it was such a turbulent time, and it was such a pivotal time that even his short tenure resulted in some good things, even though he had insurmountable obstacles. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll take questions.
Thank you. That was great. I love all the photographs that you have in the book. It's really nice. So those of you that have questions, if you want to unmute or if you'd like to just put them in the chat, Sherry would love to answer questions for you. We have a couple of comments by Lucy Silva. Dirty streets is a judgment, nothing wrong with dirt roads. Since we still have them, I agree. And let's see, combined manhood of the South. Wow, love, it sounds like Texas, but not New Mexico. So I think there was just a lot of things going on at that time. People coming into the state. Anyone have any questions?
Yes.
David?
Yes. I'm familiar with Waitman quite a bit for a entirely different reason. But I just read Representative Phelps from Missouri's criticism of Calhoun, accusing him of being pro-slavery and, in fact, condoning some slave trade with Utah. Can you talk about anything about that?
Yeah, I wrote about that in the book, and as it turns out, it was an incident. It was an incident that was misunderstood and misreported deliberately. There was a party of New Mexicans who went to Utah to trade with the Utes. I think, and let's see, and now I'm having a senior moment, and I don't remember the whole thing, but it was made out to be a slave trading. It was made out to be a slave trading expedition, and it wasn't. It was just a trading expedition, but these men had paperwork from Calhoun because all the traders had to be licensed by the territory before they could do business. And so because they were carrying this paperwork, I think they came into the possession of children, not on purpose, but I'm forgetting the whole circumstances. Anyway, his enemies used this to blame Calhoun. It produced headlines in Utah and Washington D.C. It was not true, and it was not fair. And the traders, by the way, were a constant headache to Calhoun.
Okay.
Thank you. So someone posted, where is the tombstone? She missed what you said the location was.
Oh, okay. The tombstone is in Kansas City at the Union Cemetery.
Hmm. It's big too, it looks like, from the picture. So any other?
You know, it has this nice tombstone courtesy of the Historical Society, because some years ago, someone took up a collection. They discovered that Calhoun was buried in Kansas City, and either didn't have a tombstone or didn't have much of a tombstone. So they took up a collection, and the Historical Society put up that tombstone, but they didn't get his birth date right.
I think that can be common actually on headstones. Any other questions? All righty. Well, Sherry, thank you so much. Best of luck with the book. And again, it comes out October or November?
November 15th. It was supposed to be out in October, but the printing companies are having COVID-related delays like everybody else, so it'll be November 15th.
All righty. Well, thank you again. Let me know when it comes out and I can put something in our newsletter. And again, best of luck, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.